colonel dropped the personnel file on the table without looking at her. "Someone want to explain," he said, "why I have a woman listed as primary shooter on a direct action team?" No one in the room answered. Staff Sergeant Daya Orin stood at the far end of the table, hands at her sides, and understood immediately that the question was not meant for her. Captain Lee, the team's senior officer, cleared his throat. "She tested highest in the battalion, sir. Rifle qualification, wind estimation, extended range. The numbers are—" "I don't care about the numbers. The colonel, his name was Whitfield, and he had 22 years on Daya and zero patience for anything that disrupted his idea of how things were supposed to work. Finally looked at her. "What's your background, Sergeant?" 5 years infantry, sir. 2 deployments. Qualified expert on the M110. Additional training in ballistics and environmental calculation at Bragg. Whitfield studied her for a moment, the way a man studies something he's already decided is wrong before confirming it. "How many confirmed long-range engagements?" 3, sir. Longest at 1,620 meters. He nodded slowly, then looked at Lee. "Pull her and put Renker in the slot." Lee hesitated. "Sir, Renker tested 140 points below. Put Renker in the slot." That was how it started. Not with anything dramatic, not with shouting or formal complaint filed in triplicate. Just a colonel who didn't like what he saw, and a decision made in under 4 minutes. Daya picked up her file from the table herself, because no one else moved to hand it back to her, and walked out of the briefing room while they were still talking. She did not slam the door. She had learned early that slamming doors gave people a story to tell about you. Daya Orin had grown up in Tucson, the middle child of 3, in a house where the television stayed on through dinner, and her father came home from his shift at the copper mine with dust in the creases of his hands that didn't wash out completely for 2 days. She had been the quiet one. Her older brother talked constantly. Her younger sister cried at everything, and Daya had learned to stay still and watch. She watched the way her father's jaw tightened when the foreman's name came up. She watched the way her mother set her coffee cup down more carefully when money was short. She learned to read rooms the way some people learn to read maps. Not from any single feature, but from the whole shape of things. She enlisted at 19, 2 weeks after her brother came home from his first deployment with his hearing half gone in one ear and a look behind his eyes she didn't recognize. She had not enlisted because of him exactly. She had enlisted because of the look, because something had happened to him that mattered, and she wanted to understand what it was. She understood it eventually. It took 2 years. What she hadn't expected was the shooting. She was not, as a girl, someone who thought about rifles. The first time she fired one in basic, it felt like someone had shoved a piston into her shoulder. Her instructor, a sergeant first class from Georgia named Towell, watched her hit 7 out of 10 on her first range day and said nothing. On the second day, she hit 9. On the third day, she hit all 10, and Towell walked down the line and stood next to her for a moment without speaking. "Again," he said finally. She fired again. 10 for 10. "You know what you're doing different from the others?" he asked. "No, Sergeant." "Nothing," he said. "That's what you're doing different." She didn't understand what he meant until much later. "Most shooters," he explained eventually, "were doing something, fighting the trigger, anticipating recoil, thinking about the shot. Daya was empty. She aimed and waited and let the rifle do what it was built to do. It wasn't skill, not at first. It was an absence of interference. The skill came later, when she learned to be empty on purpose, to make the stillness deliberate. By the end of her first year in service, she was shooting past a kilometer with consistency that made her range officers uncomfortable, in the specific way that male range officers get uncomfortable when a woman is the best person on the line. They didn't say anything outright. They never said anything outright. The deployment Daya found herself on was to a forward operating base in eastern Syria, a place that had been significant once and now existed primarily as a logistics node, and a reminder that significant places lose that status slowly and without announcement. The team she'd been assigned to, reduced now, with Renker in her slot, was running route clearance and occasional cordon and search operations in a cluster of villages that had been quiet for 8 months in the specific way that quiet sometimes means patience rather than peace. She was assigned to the intelligence section. Not because anyone had asked about her background in signals analysis, which she had, but because the team was overstaffed on the clearance side and the S2 shop had a gap. She filed reports. She cross-referenced patrol data with incident patterns. She spent 3 weeks doing work that was useful in the way that all necessary maintenance is useful. Nobody notices until it stops. Renker, meanwhile, was struggling. She didn't take satisfaction in this. That would have required a kind of active attention to him that she'd trained herself out of. But she noticed it. The way she noticed everything, the way his groupings at the range had opened up, the way Lee sometimes paused before assigning him to overwatch positions, the small compensations the team was making around a weakness, nobody was formally acknowledging. The operation was scheduled for the 14th of the month. 3 vehicles, 2 clearance elements, a support by fire position on the ridgeline north of the village. The objective was a compound that had flagged in 3 separate reporting threads as a potential transit point for a network that moved both personnel and materiel across a supply corridor that ran east into Iraq. Daya had written part of the analysis that flagged it. Nobody had asked her about that. The report had her initials in the corner. Lee had signed off on it. It had gone up the chain with no particular attention to where it originated. She found out about the operation the way she found out about most things at the FOB, not through official channels, but through the specific osmosis of a small base, where people ate in the same dining facility and slept in adjacent structures, and the information moved faster than the paperwork that was supposed to carry it. The night before the operation, she went to the range. The range at this FOB was nothing like the ranges back at Bragg. It was a cleared strip of ground behind the motor pool, marked at distances with painted rocks, lit by a single pole lamp that buzzed in a way that made you aware of how quiet everything else was. She signed out a rifle, her own M110, which she maintained herself and kept in a condition that the armorer had once described as compulsively good, and she shot for an hour in the dark. Not because she knew what was coming, because she always did it, which meant she left nothing to assumption and nothing to luck. The operation went wrong in the way that operations go wrong when the problem is not incompetence but incomplete information. The 3-vehicle element moved out at 033, reached the cordon line by 04112, and had the compound surrounded by 0430. The clearance team made entry at 0441. What they found inside was not a transit point, but an occupied position, 11 fighters, who had been expecting the approach from a different direction and had had enough warning to prepare for the one they were actually facing. The firefight lasted 4 minutes and 40 seconds before the clearance element broke contact and pulled back to the vehicles. 2 soldiers were wounded, neither critically. The element retreated north along a secondary route that the planning cell had designated as the alternate exfil corridor. The problem with the alternate exfil corridor was that it ran through a wadi, a dry riverbed with walls that rose 4 meters on either side for approximately 300 meters. 300 meters of zero cover, zero concealment, and a predictable line of movement. The fighters from the compound had anticipated this too. They had positioned 2 elements on the ridge line east of the wadi, elevated, with sight lines down the length of the kill zone. The first vehicle took fire at 0501. It didn't stop moving, but the driver was hit and the vehicle drifted and struck the eastern wall of the wadi and stopped. The other 2 vehicles stopped behind it. 12 soldiers in 3 vehicles in a kill zone, with no lateral movement available, taking fire from an elevated position 890 meters to the east, in a second position that Lee in the first vehicle couldn't locate. Renker was in the second vehicle. He had the M110. He had a good scope and a clear field of fire from the vehicle's right side, and the eastern ridgeline was within range. But the angle was wrong for him from where he was positioned, and the second vehicle had taken a round through the windshield that had not hit anyone, but had covered everything in glass, and Renker was cutting his hands on it and couldn't find a stable platform. Lee got on the radio at 0503. All elements, we need suppression on the eastern ridge. 9 o'clock to the lead vehicle, elevation plus 40, 880 to 900 meters. Any available element. At the FOB, Daya had heard the radio traffic from the moment the element made contact. She was in the S2 shop when the operation went wrong, and she had been tracking it on the map because she had written part of the analysis, and she felt the particular responsibility of someone who had seen the problem from the inside. She knew the wadi. She had flagged it in an earlier terrain assessment as a potential vulnerability in the alternate exfil route. That assessment had also gone up the chain. She did not know if anyone had read it. She also knew from 3 weeks of looking at patrol data and incident mapping, where the second firing position most likely was. She was out of the S2 shop before Lee finished his second radio call. The ridgeline north of the FOB was 1.4 kilometers from the eastern ridge the element was taking fire from. The math was not straightforward. The elevation difference between the two ridges was something she had to calculate on her way up the hill, running in the dark with her rifle. And the mental image of the terrain map she had spent 3 weeks reading. She ran the numbers the way Towel had taught her, years ago, not by fighting the problem, but by letting it settle into the stillness she carried with her. Temperature, 61 degrees. Wind from the northwest at approximately 14 knots, based on what she could feel on the climb, consistent with the overnight readings she'd checked before going to the range the previous night. Range to target, 1,410 meters to the eastern position, based on the map. Elevation advantage, approximately 180 meters. The second position, the one Lee couldn't find, she put at the northern end of the same ridge, roughly 1,380 meters from her, offset 22 degrees from the primary position. She reached the northern ridgeline at 0507. She set up in under 90 seconds. Prone behind a limestone outcrop, bipod deployed, scope dialed, breathing slowed to something that someone watching would have described as unnervingly calm. The vehicles in the wadi were visible at the limit of her sight. The eastern ridgeline was lit faintly by the earliest edge of dawn. She found the primary position first. Two figures, partially defilated, using a shallow depression in the rock. They were firing in sustained intervals, which told her something about their ammunition and something about their confidence. They expected this to end on their terms, and were not in a hurry. She waited for a lull in the firing. She found her stillness. She fired. The distance was 1,410 meters. The round traveled for just over 1.5 seconds before it reached the primary position. In that time, Daya had already shifted her point of aim 12 degrees north, adjusting for the offset she'd calculated for the second position, and she was waiting. The second position broke cover at the sound of the first shot. Movement draws the eye. It also draws the scope. She found the figure in the reticle, and she let the stillness do what it did. She fired again. On the radio, Lee's voice, "Say again, who is that? Who is firing from the north?" The after-action report listed the engagements as 1,410 meters and 1,385 meters. The team recovered from the wadi without further casualties. The wounded driver was evacuated to a forward surgical unit and spent 4 days there before being returned to duty. The second wounded soldier, a corporal named from the clearance element, had a through-and-through to the left forearm that required surgery and ended his deployment. 12 people came back from the wadi alive, who had a reasonable chance of not coming back at all. Daya wrote none of this in any official document. She didn't write anything official about that morning. She filed her analysis reports and her pattern assessments, and she continued doing the work that nobody had asked about. Lee came to find her 2 days later. He didn't make a production of it. He came to the S2 shop after the evening meal when the building was mostly empty, and he sat down across from her at the table she used as a desk, and he looked at her for a moment in a way that reminded her of Towel years ago. The silence before the thing that actually needed saying. "Those calculations," he said. "From the North Ridge line, you ran those in the dark." "Yes, sir." "On the move?" "Yes, sir." He was quiet for a moment. "How long have you been doing wind estimation?" "Since basic, sir." He nodded. He looked at the table. "The second position," he said. "How did you know where it was?" "Pattern analysis, sir. I'd been tracking incident data in this corridor for 3 weeks. Ambush setups in this terrain consistently use a northern offset on the secondary position. The primary draws attention. The secondary takes the exfil. You flagged that in the terrain assessment." "Yes, sir." "I read it," he said. "I didn't." He stopped. He started again. "I should have pushed that harder up the chain." Daya said nothing. Lee was a good officer. She had understood this from the first week. Good officers sometimes failed to push things up the chain, not because they were careless, but because the chain was long, and the resistance was real, and the people at the top had already decided what they were going to see. "There's going to be a commendation," Lee said. "I'm recommending you for a Bronze Star with Valor. I want you to know that." "Yes, sir. I also want you to know that I'm going to Whitfield directly. Not around him. Directly." She looked at him. "Sir, I'm going to walk into his office," Lee said, "and I'm going to tell him exactly what happened. And I'm going to tell him what would have happened if you'd been in Renker's slot." He paused. "I'm not doing that for your career, Sergeant. I'm doing it because it's true, and because he should know what decisions he's making when he makes them. He should understand what those decisions cost." She thought about that for a moment. She thought about the colonel who had looked at her file and decided in 4 minutes, and about the range at Bragg, where Towell had watched her hit 10 for 10 and told her she was doing nothing, and about her brother who had come home with that look behind his eyes. "Will it change anything?" she asked. "I don't know," Lee said, "but it'll be documented, and the people in that wadi will know." The commendation ceremony was held at the FOB at 1600 on a Thursday in the gravel yard between the operations center and the motor pool. It was not a large event. The team was there, and the FOB commander and a chaplain who stood slightly to the left and appeared to have been told about the ceremony that morning. The sky over the valley was the particular shade of orange that happens in that part of the world in late afternoon, when the dust in the air catches the light and holds it. Lee read the citation. He read it slowly and precisely, the way he did everything, and Daya stood at attention and listened to it the way she listened to range wind, not with effort, but with the particular stillness that she had spent years learning to maintain. The citation described the engagements. It described the distances and the conditions and the 2 firing positions eliminated and the 12 personnel recovered from the kill zone. It described the terrain analysis that had identified the vulnerability in the exfil route and the pattern assessment that had allowed for accurate estimation of the secondary position. It said her name, Staff Sergeant Daya Orin, 11 times. She had counted. The FEB commander pinned the medal himself. Colonel Whitfield was not present. Nobody commented on his absence. Afterward, standing in the gravel, with the dust still orange around them, one of the soldiers from the clearance element, a young specialist named Tatum, who had been in the first vehicle when it went into the wadi wall, came and stood next to her. He was not good at talking to people yet. She could see that. He was the kind of young soldier who still wore his earnestness close to the surface, where everything could reach it. "I read the terrain assessment," he said. "After. The one you wrote." She looked at him. "It said the wadi was the problem," he said. "It said the alternate exfil was the vulnerability." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "If somebody had?" He stopped. He was trying to figure out how to say something that he didn't quite have the language for yet. "If the right people had read it, they might have," she said, "or they might not have. That's not something you can control." "Doesn't that?" He stopped again. "Doesn't that make you angry?" Daya looked out at the valley. The light was going now, the orange fading to something flatter and darker at the edges. Somewhere past the ridgeline, the terrain fell away into the corridor that ran east. The same corridor she had tracked for 3 weeks. In the S2 shop, the same one the network had been using and would probably continue to use through a different node, through a different transit point. Until someone mapped that one too. "Yes," she said. She said it simply, without apology, the way her father used to answer her mother's questions when he was too tired to be diplomatic about something that was simply true. "But angry doesn't change the math," she said. "You still have to run the numbers." Tatum nodded slowly. He didn't fully understand it yet. He would, eventually. She had learned that about most things. They made more sense in retrospect when you were far enough away from them to see the whole shape. Colonel Whitfield requested a meeting with her 8 days after the ceremony. She expected it, in the way that she expected most things she'd already seen the shape of from a distance. She came to his office at 0800. He was behind his desk, and the office was the way senior officer offices always were. Plaques on the wall, a flag in the corner, the accumulated evidence of 22 years of someone else's certainty. He gestured to the chair across from him, and she sat. He didn't begin with the wadi. He began instead with the terrain assessment. "I read it last week," he said. "The full version, not the summary." "Yes, sir." "And the pattern analysis from the 3 weeks prior." "Yes, sir." He was quiet. He had the expression of a man who was working through something he hadn't expected to have to work through at this point in his career. She recognized it. It was the expression of recalculation, of someone who had looked at the numbers and found that they didn't come out the way he'd expected. "The wadi flag," he said. "You recommended the primary exfil as the alternate. Swap, yes, sir? And that wasn't implemented." "No, sir." He looked at his desk. He was not a man who apologized easily. She could see that immediately, from the specific tension around his jaw, the way he was choosing his words. But he was also, she now understood, a man who was capable of looking at what the numbers told him and accepting it, even when it was uncomfortable. "Sergeant," he said, "I made a personnel decision that I would make differently now." She waited. "That's not a statement I make often," he said. "You should understand that." "Yes, sir. I want to know, he said, what else you've written that I should be reading. She thought about this. She thought about the corridor assessment she'd been working on for the past week, the one that mapped probable network adaptation following the operation, the pivot points where the logistics chain would try to reconstitute. She thought about the 3 weeks of data she had been sitting with, the patterns she had traced not because anyone asked her to, but because the shape of them was there, and she couldn't look at a map without seeing it. I have an ongoing analysis, sir, she said. Current as of yesterday. Bring it to me tomorrow, he said, 700. He stood. She stood. He extended his hand across the desk. She shook it. Not because the handshake resolved anything. It didn't. Not the 4-minute decision. Not the personnel file dropped on the table without looking at her. Not the wadi. Not the ceremony he hadn't attended. A handshake didn't recalibrate 22 years of how someone understood the world. But she took it, because Lee had been right. It mattered that Whitfield understood what his decisions cost. And because the handshake was evidence of something, not a transformation, but a recalculation. The man standing across the desk from her had looked at the numbers and admitted they didn't come out the way he thought. In her experience, that was rarer than it should have been. She went back to the S2 shop. She sat down at her table, and she opened the corridor analysis, and she went back to work. Outside, the valley was bright and dry, and the dust moved along the ridge in the way it always did. In the morning, light enough to be visible, constant enough to be calculated. She had learned the wind here. She had learned its speed and its pattern, and the way it shifted at elevations versus in the wadi floor. She had entered it into her calculations the night before the operation, and the calculations had been correct. The math was always there. Patient, indifferent to opinion, waiting to be run by anyone willing to sit still long enough to run it. She had been willing. That, in the end, was all any of it had ever required.